So you said here too, let's go for another quote here. Throughout your life, this is very practical advice too, and I think it's very wise from a therapeutic perspective. Throughout your life, you have people you look up to. Okay, so let's think about that. You look up. What does that mean? Why up? Well, up is something that beckons from a distance. It's like a light on a hill, and we automatically assume that those who we admire are people we look up to. So that specifies a distance and a direction, and it's uphill. It's up toward a higher vista, let's say. So there are automatically people who elicit that spirit in you. You have noticed the way.
Might also imply that there's some sense of struggle required to get to that point, because it's easier to go downhill than it is uphill.
Yes, definitely. That's right. It's an uphill trek. And it also implies judgment, because if someone's above you, then they also serve as a judge, or you serve as a judge in relationship to them, because you compare yourself unfavorably with them. And that can also inspire you to tear them down. That's really the story of Cain and Abel, and that's a major story. You have noticed the way a teacher, parent, coworker, mentor, or friend interacts with others, and you come away thinking, that behavior simply works better. They are respected, admired, and successful. And you find yourself wondering why that is. You do if you're a little bit humble instead of being envious, right? Because otherwise you think, well, that damn crook, he just stole his position, and that's why he's got it. But if you're a bit humble, you might think, well, no, that guy looks successful. Maybe he knows something I don't. You are noticing attributes and character traits that are good and worth aspiring to. You are noticing attributes that make certain people more successful than others. You are noticing what a hero looks like. And in the process, you are discovering a path made up of desirable personality traits that helps you ascend in social hierarchies. That's Jacob's ladder, by the way. That ladder that is the hierarchy to the good. That's the vision Jacob has of the pathway to God, is that it's a hierarchical structure with the thing that's ultimately good at the pinnacle, by definition, right? The best of all possible goods. And then there are intermediary structures all the way up, and beings inhabiting those structures. And this isn't metaphysical. It's like if you find someone you admire, the reason you admire them is because they're higher up in that heavenly hierarchy, so to speak, than you are. And your whole nervous system tells you that. You're compelled to listen, you're compelled to pay attention by the action of your own unconscious mind.
You know, what's interesting about this point of identifying these heroes or at least role models, you can call them either one. I just thought heroes was a more compelling word to use for the sake of writing it. But what's interesting about it too is how pop culture actually plays a pretty important part of this, because like there's plenty of people who simply don't have these good role models in their lives, and you have to acknowledge that. And so where are they supposed to turn? And it's maybe one of the reasons that it's so important to fight these cultural wars that you and I engage in on a fairly regular basis, that they become a serious part of our politics, which at the same time is necessary, but also deeply, deeply unfortunate. I do think the attack on pop culture from this progressive victimhood left has reached a ceiling. I think there's a serious backlash. You look at movies like Top Gun, the recent one, Top Gun, but maybe like the highest grossing of all time. Absolutely phenomenal movie. Really fun to watch. Why? Because it just had all of these classical virtues infused within it about relationships and about how you treat people and what the consequences are for treating people as such. That these things speak to people in a deeper way. They can't necessarily articulate them, but they understand it when they see it. And there's these sort of radical minorities that are very loud that want that changed. You know, they want something else to be on that hill, but people react against it because it's not true. There's no truth to that.
And something cries out from inside of them then, and that can be appealed to by a storyteller. I saw the same thing in the Marvel Avengers series, is that there is a return to any wide range of classical virtues, certainly brotherhood, a kind of a military ethos, sacrifice, a striving upward, certainly masculine virtues, the combination of the Hulk and Iron Man, for example, that's There's a monstrous element to the Hulk, but he's a hero in a strange sense, and he's also the revitalizing force for Iron Man when he just about dies, and that's all. The reason those movies were so necessary and so attractive is because they are, in fact, addressing a radical conceptual void in the culture, and it's a void that you're addressing in your book, especially with your appeal, trifold appeal, let's say, to duty, responsibility, and humor at the same time, right? Which is a kind of stoicism in the face of catastrophe. You know, if you don't know what you should do with your life, you don't know who you should be, sometimes you think about that as what career you should pursue, but here's another way of thinking about it. It's kind of a SEAL's ethos that Congressman Crenshaw detailed out. Here's some things you could be. Those are my words. These are his. You will be someone who's never late. You will be someone who takes care of his men, gets to know them, and puts their needs before yours. You will be someone who does not quit in the face of adversity. You will be someone who takes charge and leads when no one else will. You will be detail-oriented, which you discuss a lot in later sections of the book, always vigilant, attentive. You will be aggressive in your actions, but never lose your cool. You will have a sense of humor, because sometimes that is all that can get you through the darkest hours. You will work hard and perform, even when no one is watching. You'll be creative and think outside the box, even if it gets you in trouble. You're a rebel, but not a mutineer. You are a jack of all trades and master of none. And then you follow that a little later with this paragraph, these paragraphs. Be aggressive enough to kill the enemy, but immediately calm enough not to scare the little old lady. You'll be that man who's mentally tough enough to operate in horrific chaos, then immediately transition to tranquility, all without mentally breaking. You will effectively transition from hyper-masculine aggressor to gentle caretaker. You'll be both a warrior and a gentleman. The qualities that made SEAL leaders great were rarely physical in nature. They listened. They empowered their team to be successful, carefully entrusting individuals with additional responsibility. It's a real conservative ethos there. They highlighted good performance publicly and criticized bad performance privately. And so, those are lists of virtues, and maybe they're not the only list of possible virtues, probably not, but if you're lost and you don't know where to start, practicing, you also talk about this idea that, this is an Aristotelian idea, that we are our habits, we become what we practice, and imagine if you're lost and you're listening, you think, you find some things admirable, you could practice those things, and you could practice them locally and minimally in your own relationships, and you can start to get good at them. And as you get good at them, you get better at them, right? And then you can broaden out the scope of your action into a wider purview. This is a big problem in life. Imagine you're aiming for something and then something happens to make it impossible, or you find out that it's the wrong thing because you were aiming in the wrong direction. So then what do you have to rely on to set you right? It's not your aim, obviously, but it might be your capacity to take new aim, and that's bloody well dependent on your character. That's for sure. And so I don't think there is a more fundamental aim than what you should be, and there's no better way of characterizing what you should be than that you should fortify your character. You want to be productive. Yeah, the best definition I ever read of Christian charity, maybe just of charity in general. Generosity plus productivity. And look, people like to stress the first, especially when they aren't the second. It's like, I'm generous. It's like, yeah, but you don't have anything. So that's, Now, I'm not talking about the people who truly have nothing and are still willing to share. I'm talking about the people who pull down the productive well, hyping their own generosity and forgetting that you'd be even better at being generous if you were also productive.
So I hear from socialists a lot that Jesus was a socialist. This is a common refrain from the progressive left, and the idea being that you should want to give charity. And I said, Jesus wasn't saying that you should take from others and make them give charity. That wasn't what he said. You need to be generous with your belongings, with your time, with your labor. That's what he was saying. It was a generosity of the heart, not a demand on others.
That's right. Well, that's absolutely 100% correct. It's an injunction towards the highest form of self-sacrifice. Period. The end. Obviously, that's what the crucifixion means, the acceptance of that catastrophic death, all of the, what would you say, the tragedy of life, and then even a further radical acceptance of the necessity to confront hell. That's self-sacrifice. That is not calling for moral actions on the part of others on your behalf. Definitely 100% not. And that self-sacrifice is called upon even if you're innocent, right? So it's even more than that. You want to have the ability to delay gratification. That ties in with what we talked about earlier about being able to treat yourself as if you're a community across time. Because to delay gratification means to sacrifice the hedonism of the present to the security and iterability of the future. And so that is a hallmark of maturity. That's also the ability to make sacrifices. That's why the sacrificial motif is stressed so hard in the Old Testament. You have to make sacrifices. To what? Well, to whatever you value. Well, what's the highest value? Well, by definition, that's God. So do you sacrifice to God? Well, if you sacrifice at all, you sacrifice to a God. Maybe you don't sacrifice. Well, then you're immature. Maybe you sacrifice to a lesser God. Then maybe you should get your act together. That's all tied together integrally with the notion of the ability to delay gratification. That's why God tells Adam and Eve that they're condemned to work when they get thrown out of the Garden of Eden. It's like, well, now you have to work because you're aware of the future. Well, that's a call to sacrifice because work is a sacrificial act. And then the question is, in service of what?
And there's another chapter in the book called Do Something Hard. It's pretty direct and straightforward there. But what we're getting at is that there's a problem in our society where we do our best to alleviate any kind of suffering, as if we feel that there's this utopia available to us where suffering can be completely removed from our lives. But that's a false promise. That's a false God. It's impossible. And worse than that, it prevents that sacrifice that you're talking about. It prevents that uphill climb because people are told to feel that there's some sense of injustice if you have to work harder than anyone else for something else, and they're blinded as to why. And look, maybe you do have to work harder than someone else to get to the same point. I'm not saying that's impossible, but
we all do. That's true for all of us, right? Because with our genetic inheritance, let's say, some things come relatively easy to us and some things are virtually impossible and have to be strived for mightily. And I'm also not saying that some people aren't, what would you say, condemned in some fundamental way in multiple dimensions simultaneously. I mean, I've had people in my clinical practice and met people in my private life who are burdened by so many difficulties simultaneously that it's almost incomprehensible. So I'm not saying there's something even-handed about this, but all of us have to work very hard on certain fronts to be better and to do better. And it's also not obvious to me that that's an unbearable price in some sense, but it's also the most fundamental disciplining adventure, right? And I don't know what it's like for you. I suspect it's the same, but when I look back in my life, I think when I'm thinking in a positive way, I think, well, that was really difficult, but it was worth it. And those two things are integrally associated, right? Because you don't generally say, well, that was easy, but it was worth it. And so what that seems to mean is that the difficulty is intrinsically bound up with the reward. And then, of course, we know that, right? Because how happy are you even for someone else when you see them overcome immense odds to attain something of value? Everyone stands up and cheers when that happens. One of the things that's very interesting about Exodus is that when God tells the pharaonic tyrant to free the Israelites, he always uses the same phrase, and you only ever hear half the phrase. He has Moses say, "Let my people go." Now you hear that phrase all the time, but you don't hear the second half of the phrase, which is repeated, I think 9 times, one for each plague, perhaps 10 times, because there's actually 10 plagues. If you count the devastation of the firstborns, that's the 10th plague. God has Moses say, "Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness." And that's really interesting, because it's not, and Dennis Prager pointed out, that the word freedom isn't used once in the Exodus narrative. And it's because the freedom from tyranny isn't hedonism. It's not the blind pursuit of passions. It's the servitude to a higher purpose. Proper freedom is servitude to a higher purpose, voluntarily accepted servitude to a higher purpose, perhaps the highest purpose, which is what God calls the Israelites to. And you say in your book here, purpose is meaning. That's a hell of a thing if it's true. Purpose is meaning, especially if you find purpose in duty and responsibility, and I think you genuinely do, in sacrifice. I think that's true, deeply true. Purpose is meaning, and meaning is happiness. We don't think about happiness enough, and when we do not necessarily think about it properly. Happiness is neither joy nor entertainment. It is an ontological condition fundamental to our existence as humans. It's notable that when the founders drafted the Declaration of Independence, they listed up front 3 things to which we are all entitled: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A little later you say, "You need to understand that your purpose may be great in the eyes of the world, or it may be commonplace and seemingly small. Your purpose might be your family, your children. It might be tutoring a child and changing their life. It might be the business you started. It might be cleaning up your block. It might be in the help you give others. It might be in the example you set." And then you say, as John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And so I love the way that's all tied together, that happiness is to be found in the pursuit of meaning and purpose, and that's tied up with duty and responsibility to others. I think that's fundamentally true. And I do think that's the way out of the deepest suffering. If you're uncertain about what you're doing and you don't know if you should change course, set yourself the obligation to choose something more difficult before you change course. Because there's a moral hazard, right? It's like, well, am I unhappy or am I just useless? It's like, well, a little of column A and a little of column B. Well, how do I fortify myself against my uselessness? I don't allow myself to switch course unless the challenge increases. And that works, it's a check against your own laziness and inertia and envy and resentment. Because then too, you can say to yourself, well, I moved from there. I didn't fail, I didn't quit, I chose something more difficult. And so I can have some faith in my choice. Maybe I can have some faith in my choice because you accepted a bigger challenge. If you want to stand up for yourself, you have to have your goals and your vision well laid out and well defined, and then you have to have a strategy that is matched to those goals, so that you know what you want, so that you know when you're not getting it. Otherwise, you're left with a vague sense of dissatisfaction and resentment, and that's a very, very difficult thing to articulate. And if you can't articulate it, then you can't negotiate. If you know what you want and you know why, then you can make a case for yourself. Okay, so let's assume now that you've laid out a vision and a counter vision, which the Future Authoring Program also helps you do, so you know what kind of hell you want to avoid, that you might drift into if you were too agreeable for the rest of your life. That would be a hell that consisted mostly of people taking advantage of you all the time and you feeling resentful and bitter about it. Not something I would recommend. See, I think that women are agreeable because it helps them deal with infants, but it's not a great temperamental strategy for dealing with complex organizations in the adult world. So I think it's a price that women pay for also being adapted to have plenty of patience for very young children. And then you have to overcome that to some degree to put yourself forward properly in more complex hierarchies of accomplishment. So I would say once you have your vision established, your vision for the future and your countervision, so you're afraid of what will happen if you don't stand up for yourself, then you need to consult your resentment. Because if you're resentful about something, as far as I can tell, there's generally only two reasons. One is you should grow the hell up and quit whining. So you got to find out first if you're just feeling sorry for yourself, and you can think that through, make a pro and con case, and you can talk to somebody that you care about that. I'm not assuming that that's the reason, but that's one potential reason. If you're not merely feeling sorry for yourself, then you probably have something to say and something that you need. And you need to figure out what that is, and then you have to develop a strategy to put that forward. I've seen lots of people in my personal life and in my private practice not get what they want because, well, A, they don't specify it, and B, they don't ask for it. And if you're negotiating, say, for a raise or for a promotion and so forth, you have to put yourself forward. You need to tell the person you're working for why you should be treated with more consideration or respect, or have more resources devoted to you, or more authority shifted to you. And you have to make a case for that, a compelling case, so that they have a reason to attend to you. And they're not going to notice, because most managerial types are so overloaded with work that they never notice when anything's going right. They just notice the things that are going wrong. So you need to make a plan. You have to have a strategy that goes along with that plan. You have to have articulated arguments for why a certain form of treatment is appropriate to you. And then you have to have the courage to put that forward. And I guess you have to remember that you owe yourself as much as you owe other people. You have to take care of yourself like you take care of other people. And that's a moral duty. And if you practice that, you can do it. And a lot of that's also associated with telling the truth. You know, you don't have a better friend than the truth, even though it can be very harsh in the short term. And so if you're unhappy at work because you're being taken advantage of, then you have to strategize yourself out of that. You have to learn to negotiate. And a lot of that also means that you have to overcome your hesitancy to engage in conflict. And you got to think about it this way. Negotiation and conflict are somewhat indistinguishable. And it's easy moment to moment to avoid negotiation and conflict, but you pay a terrible price for it in the medium to long term. It's better to face the conflict forthrightly in the present and make peace for the medium to long term. And there's courage in that. So that's the other thing I would say is gird up your loins and allow yourself to act courageously and truthfully. One of the things you deal with very commonly if you're a clinical psychologist, apart from depression and anxiety, is, well, behavior therapists offer assertiveness training. And now, the people who need assertiveness training are often people who are too agreeable, compassionate, polite by temperament. Now, the problem with that is that they let people walk all over them because they don't stand up enough for themselves. And the consequence of that is they get resentful, and then they get bitter, and then they get conniving, and then they'll mob. And so, because they'll do anything for everyone else, but they push themselves beyond their limits, and then they won't even recognize the limits because they feel, well, if I'm not doing everything for you, then I'm not a good person. It's like, no, a good person does a little for you. Like if I'm acting properly with you, say in this conversation, there's something in it for you, and there's something in it for me, right? And we want that to be reciprocal. And so the cost of me bending too far in your direction is that I'll become bitter and resentful and conniving. And resentment is an unbelievably toxic state of being. It starts out with the admission that life is brutally difficult and sometimes unbearably brutally difficult. And you can see the progressives playing with that notion. It's warped into this sense of victimization, but it does reflect some understanding of the underlying tragic reality of life. And so it's good to get that right out on the table to begin with. Say, well, you're miserable, you have your reasons, and they might be deep reasons. But if you let the misery demoralize you and make you bitter and cynical and cowardly and make you withdraw, then first of all, that's a failure in the highest sense on your part, and all it's going to do is make everything worse. And then you might think, well, what do you have to respond to that? How do you respond to that catastrophe and challenge? And the answer is, and this is what Rocky is telling his son in no uncertain terms, is like, terrible as things are, there's a lot more to you than you can possibly imagine. And that if you face those things forthrightly and with some faith and courage, then you can have the adventure of your life and prevail even over catastrophe. One of the advantages to having the computational power we have is that everything is at your fingertips. And the disadvantage is that everything's in your face. And by everything, it might be 40 million pornographic images. Like, that's a lot. Or an endless array of tragic scenarios. And really endless. And so that's a problem. And the fundamental problem is, how do you handle the fire hose of information? And no one really knows the answer to that. But we should also point out that it's no wonder that young people are demoralized and anxious, because we're doing everything we can to demoralize them and make them anxious. So on the masculine front, we tell young boys that, well, the world's a terrible patriarchal tyranny, and all of that patriarchal tyranny, which is the whole explanation for history, has done nothing but oppress and exploit people and destroy the planet. And so that any manifestation of that masculine impulse on your part is equivalent to the world-destroying force. I hope to encourage people. Other than that, I want to see what happens. You know, I want to say what I believe to be true as clearly and carefully as I possibly can, and I want to see what happens as a consequence. And what people don't understand about that, in some sense, is your happiness. The purpose of your life is not going to be happiness. Sometimes it is. Sometimes that will come. But there will be difficult periods in your life, and happiness won't suffice then. But what you can have in your life is an adventure. You can have an adventure. And the truth is the best adventure. There's no doubt about that. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, you don't know what's going to happen if you say what you think. Now, I don't mean incautiously, and I don't mean provocatively or any more than necessary. You don't know what's going to happen. So that's very adventurous. But also, if it's you and your voice, then it's your adventure. And if it isn't, like if you're crafting your speech or manipulating in any way, or parroting or abiding by the dictates of the crowd, then I don't know whose adventure you're having, but it's not yours. But I'll tell you something else that's really weird. I don't understand this either. So, more than 90% of the people who watch my videos on YouTube are men. Now that's weird, because about 80% of psychology students are women. So that is not what you would expect, right? You would expect that the majority of them would be women. And you might say, well, it's because of the political stance I've taken. And I thought, well, that's possible. So I went and looked at the demographic data, because I have that. Well, before I did any of the political videos, 85% of my viewers were men. So it's actually increased a bit. It's increased by 6%. And that's not trivial, but it was still overwhelmingly men. So that was interesting. I thought, what the hell? Why is that exactly? And then now I've been watching crowds when I've been talking to them. And the crowds that have come to see me in person. This happened at the University of Toronto free speech debate. And I actually noticed it and commented on it before the debate took place, because I was talking about intrinsic differences between men and women. And I looked around the room and I thought, hey, 80% of the people in this room are men. So I had all the women stand up, and then all the men stand up. I said, look, like, here's a natural experiment. For some reason, 80% of the people who showed up to this are men. Now, everybody thought I was kind of cracked to do that. And it was a risk, you know, but I thought, no, there's something going on here. And then what's interesting now is that every public appearance that I've made that's related to the sort of topics that we're discussing is overwhelmingly men. It's like 85 to 90%. And so I thought, wow, that's weird. Like, what the hell's going on here exactly? And then the other thing I've noticed is that I've been talking a lot to the crowds that I've been talking to, not about rights, but about responsibility, right? Because you can't have the bloody conversation. What are you doing? You can't have the conversation about rights without the conversation about responsibility, because your rights are my responsibility. That's what they are, technically. So you just can't have only half of that discussion. And we're only having half that discussion. And the question is, well, what the hell are you leaving out if you only have that half of the discussion? And the answer is, well, you're leaving out responsibility. And then the question is, well, what are you leaving out if you're leaving out responsibility? And the answer might be, well, maybe you're leaving out the meaning of life. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, here you are, suffering away. What makes it worthwhile? Rights? You know, you're completely out. You have no idea what it's almost impossible to describe how bad an idea that is. Responsibility. That's what gives life meaning. It's like lift a load. Then you can tolerate yourself, right? Because look, you're useless, easily hurt, easily killed. Why should you have any self-respect? That's the story of the fall. Pick something up and carry it. Make it heavy enough so that you can think, yeah, well, useless as I am, at least I could move that from there to there. Well, what's really cool about that is that when I talk to these crowds about this, the men's eyes light up. But this responsibility thing, that's a whole new order of this, is that young men are so hungry for that, it is unbelievable. People have been after me for a long time because I've been speaking to disaffected young men. You know, what a terrible thing to do that is. I thought the marginalized were supposed to have a voice.
It's making you emotional, talk about that.
Well, God, you know. It's very difficult to understand how demoralized people are. And certainly many young men are in that category. And you get these casual insults, these incels. What does it mean? It's like, well, these men, they don't know how to make themselves attractive to women who are very picky, and good for them. Women, like, be picky. That's your gift, man. Demand high standards from your men. Fair enough. But all these men who are alienated, it's like they're lonesome and they don't know what to do, and everyone piles abuse on them. When she said that, Olivia Wilde,
It stung you, didn't it? I saw the
by
reaction.
that time, you know, that as far as critiques go, that was kind of low level. I mean, once I got painted as Red Skull, you know, magical super Nazi, that was kind of the end of the insults. There's no place past that. So when Olivia Wilde made those comments, the first thing I did was go look at the preview for a movie, which I quite liked. I thought I would go see that movie probably, and perhaps I will. It didn't really bother me. My family and I talked about it right away, and we were able to respond to it with some degree of humor, which then people completely misunderstood. I said I hope that, you know, that if I had to be played by someone, I think it's Chris Wilde, he's a very good-looking man, and so that seems all right, you know. And then I said something like, I hope he gets my fashion style choice right when he plays me. And it was a joke. All that was a joke.
I mean, you've been so controlled today, and yet in that brief moment, you got very emotional. Why?
It's really something to see constantly how many people are dying for lack of an encouraging word. And how easy it is to provide that if you're careful. You know, give credit where credit is due. And to say, you're a net force for good if you want to be.
Do you believe you're a net force for good?
Net, yes. In all the details, probably not. You know, no one's perfect. So People make their mistakes as they stumble uphill.
We've met some of your fans, and we got the impression they were all male fans, the ones that we talked to, and that they were struggling with their manhood, and that you give them this message that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay, it's necessary. What the hell are we going to do without men? You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up, these men, they're doing impossible things, they're under the streets, working on the sewers, they're up on the power lines in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning, this thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death, and often literally, and the gratitude for that is sorely lacking, especially among the people who should be most grateful. You see university professors, especially of the social justice bent, who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis, making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And it's very useful to tell everyone, not just men, that they have an important role to play, a necessary role, and that if they act properly and honestly and forthrightly, that they can put their lives together and they can help their families and they can make their communities better, and that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round. And if we had any sense, we'd understand that, instead of doing everything at every possible moment to label what we have in the West as oppressive and patriarchal and fundamentally predicated on power, of all the insane propositions. I was watching The Simpsons the other day. I watched the first Simpsons episode and I deconstructed it. And so it's really interesting. So what happens in the first Simpson episode is that it's Christmas and Homer and Marge are going to buy some Christmas presents, but Homer doesn't get his Christmas bonus. And so he's absolutely crushed by that. And that actually is a recurring theme in The Simpsons, where Homer loses his job or something like that, or can't make enough money. He's completely crushed. Even though he's kind of useless, bumbling, laughing fool of a guy, you know, the thing that gives that show its soul is that he's still oriented towards his family. That's what makes him honorable, is that foolish as he is, he's decided to adopt responsibility for his family and to try to bear that. And so he's a holy fool. He's not a complete fool. And it's so interesting watching the story because he suffers dreadfully as a consequence of not being able to fulfill his responsibility. Well, that's for men. Women have their sets of responsibilities. They're not the same, right? Because they're complicated, because women, of course, have to take primary responsibility for having infants at least, but then also for caring for them. They're structured differently than men, for biological necessity, even if it's not a psychological issue, and it's also partly a psychological issue. Women know what they have to do. Men have to figure out what they have to do. And if they have nothing worth living for, then they stay Peter Pan. And why the hell not? Because the alternative to valued responsibility is impulsive, low-class pleasure.